John, you can now put on your, you can put your presentation. I will continue reading. Archives have been living with the challenges of digital records for several decades now. Yet the shift in form of the records from the physical to the intangible is momentous. It impacts every part of the archive work, from appraisal and selection to transfer, preservation, and access. The temptation to apply paper era assumptions remains strong, especially when those assumptions still hold true for tangible records. In this presentation, John will address the challenges of digital archiving, both in terms of technology and to archival practice. We will set out a prospectus for the disruptive digital archive. John, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to start by wishing you all a very good morning. I'm speaking from a gloriously sunny London. Absolutely, the weather here is fantastic, so it really feels that we have spring in the air, and it's great to be able to talk to you all this morning. So I should also say I really enjoyed listening to Tom's presentation, and a lot of the themes that he was talking about, this quest for a national archive to be relevant, to be close to people, close not just to the archive's users, but also close to record creators and close to the process of record creation, really resonated for me. Now, working as I do at the National Archives in the UK, I'm a civil servant archivist, and archives of the state, I think, really serve a unique role in any democratic society. Governments collect information about people and have done for centuries, and they do so in order to govern, not least to know who to tax, to know who owns what. And the archive of the state ends up with the records that the state amasses, and it provides citizens, I think, with two important opportunities. The first is, whereas the state spends a lot of time and effort and energy looking at us, its citizens, the archive of the state provides the citizen with the opportunity to see the state, often at a distance of some years, but through the records that the archive makes available, we can see how decisions were made. We can see the evidence that was used. We can see perhaps internal disagreements that are hidden. And the other thing that the archive of the state provides or allows is the opportunity to look back at the past through the state's eyes, to see what the state saw, its view of the society or the economy of the past. And again, this is incredibly instructive. Now, the fundamentals of the archive's work are not challenged by digital disruption, are not challenged by this shift in the nature of the record. We're still, as a state archive, looking to preserve records, provide access to records, to fulfill that piece of value, allowing people to see the state and look through the state's eyes. But much of our practice is disrupted. Now, before going on to explore that, it's worth perhaps stopping to think about some things that stay the same. And one of the things that we do here at the National Archives, very much in terms of trying to be close to people, as Tom was talking about, is we bring children into the archive and provide an experience where they can see and obtain access to original records. And this is a lovely photograph of a group of school children who've come into the National Archives here at Kew in London. Now, you may know there's way back in 1665, there was a fire in London, and it burnt down most of the centre of the city of London. And because teaching children about the fire of London is part of the curriculum in all of the schools, you can pretty much take any 5 or 6-year-old in England and interrogate them about the fire of London, and they know all the facts. They know that the fire was in 1665. They know that it started on Pudding Lane. They know it started in a bakery. They know the baker was Thomas Fariner. And when we bring the children into the archive, that's exactly what we do. We get them to tell us what happened in the fire of London. And then we pose, I think, the key question, which is, okay, so we've got a pretty clear picture of what happened, but how do you know? And you can see the children, it's like, well, my teacher told me. It's like, great. So your teacher might be in the room. It's like, your teacher wasn't there in 1665. So how do you think that they know? Like, you can see the children. How does my teacher know this? In fact, how does anybody know anything? And at this point, upon, if you like, sowing doubt about how we know, we introduce children to the records. And we have some wonderful records, as you would expect, about the fire of London and what led to it. So this is an extract from something called a Hearth Tax Return. It's a tax record. People were taxed based on the number of fires they had. And right at the bottom it says, this is the record for Pudding Lane, where the fire started. It says Thomas Fariner, and he has 5 fires and 1 oven. So suddenly we know there's a baker called Fariner on Pudding Lane. He has an oven. We have evidence. And the children, when they see the evidence, when they experience it, you can get them to cheer. Right? I now know how we know, they say. And I think that speaks to 2 fundamental values of the archive. That the archive is the place where you find the evidence that tells us how we know what we think we know, and that there is joy in discovery. And it seems to me, it seems to us at the National Archives here in the UK that giving people that sense of what an archive is and what an archive is about is a really important part of our work with connecting people and giving, particularly young people, giving them a real sense of what an archive can be and that an archive can be for them. And this is true whether we're dealing with physical records or digital records. And I think it's important that we hold on to that that notion, because for sure we are finding our work being the subject of no small disruption, and that disruption is caused by a one-off shift. Records were tangible, and now they're intangible. They are noughts and ones. And the impact of this on the archives work is profound, and something that, although we've been dealing with digital records for several decades now, we are still, as institutions, coming to terms with. Now, we see the challenge of being a digital archive as one of disruption. And the disruption is as much to our practice as an archive as anything else. And I want to share with you some thoughts about how archival practice has evolved and how digital is disrupting and continues to disrupt the ways in which we work as a national archive. Now, the National Archives in the UK has claimed to one of the leading archival thinkers of the last 130 years, so Hilary Jenkinson, who was the deputy keeper of the Public Records Office, so that's the forerunner to the National Archives, ways back in 1922, writes a manual of archive administration that for a generation or two of archivists is incredibly consequential. It really sets out how you think about running an archive. And there's no doubt, for me, working in the UK National Archives today and looking back at Jenkinson's manual, we can see the ghost still speaking to us, I suppose. We are recognisably still Jenkinson's archive in some way, particularly in terms of some of Jenkinson's ideas around appraisal and selection and the role of record creators, the worry about receiving too much information into the archive, that it becomes too cluttered. A big Jenkinson concern, and some of the concepts about how to run a reading room, all very recognisable. And in approaching the challenge of becoming a digital archive, we've very much, in the first generation of being a digital archive, approached thinking about digital archiving infrastructure as essentially looking for the digital equivalent of the analogue archive. If the analogue archive has a repository, well, we need a digital repository. If the analogue archive has massive storage, then the digital archive needs massive storage. If the analogue archive is vertically integrated, so it's doing all of storage and intellectual control and preservation and access, so the digital archive similarly should be vertically integrated. And you can see in some sense the appeal of that, but reflecting on our own practice, it speaks to, I would suggest, the extent to which archives and archivists, if you like, have a hankering for the certainty of the paper era assumptions when contemplating our digital work. And that really no longer holds true. Now, some of this has been known for a very long time. Another archival theorist, David Bierman, writing way back in 1989, says that traditional methods employed in archives for appraisal, description, preservation, and access will fail to meet archival needs because the demands exceed the capacity of the profession, and by more than an order of magnitude. Now, interestingly, Bierman advocates radical post-custodialism. And make no mistake, working in an archive, I'm a strong custodialist. I think that archival institutions add most value by taking custody of records, including digital records, because of the institutional commitment that we bring to bear to see that those records will survive into the future. That institutional commitment meaning that we are best placed to manage the risks to those records as technologies change through time. So I'm a firm custodialist, but Bierman, because of what he views as the capacity of the archival profession, advocates something very different. We see record creators, in our case government departments themselves, becoming increasingly post-custodialist. If you think of tools like Google Docs or Google Sheets, the record creator no longer has custody of the records either. The tech giants do. And again, I think here the digital archive has an important role in helping to release records from the custodians, the new custodians, perhaps on behalf of the record creators and for posterity. No matter. Bierman, way back in '89, is arguing that the traditional model of archival thinking and practice is in big trouble. But he misses something that happens at just the same moment, more or less, that has had an enormous impact for and on archives. And that's the invention by this man, Tim Berners-Lee, of the World Wide Web. Now, the web for archives really has given us a new hope in the sense that it has allowed us to widen our audience, extend our reach, and to engage far more people in our collections and in research using the records that we hold as archives than we ever could have managed. Our websites will see hundreds of thousands of visitors, where hundreds of thousands, millions of visitors, where our reading rooms may see hundreds of people a day, tens of thousands of people a year, but nothing compared to the scale of reach that the web offers the archive. So the archive gains a new audience through digital disruption and gains the opportunity for relevance, but is still left with a fundamental challenge at the core of its work around how digital records are brought into the archive and how digital records are preserved. Now, like many national archives, we've tried to seize the opportunities that the web affords us through developing our by digitizing our catalogs, by digitizing parts of our physical collections, by building or trying to build engaging and user-centered digital services. We have more to do, but in terms of ensuring that we are relevant to the users, but we still have this challenge at the heart of our work around digital. And we see our role as a digital archive as providing 4 different types of value. And some of this is very reassuring in archival terms. We're preserving digital records, contextualizing them, intellectual control, presenting them, and enabling use. And we're doing that for all kinds of things, not just things in document formats, but mixed media, structured data, even computer code can be records worthy of permanent preservation. And the center of our work as a digital archive is the active management of risk to the records that we're holding over time. And the risks that our digital collections have are exposed to the drivers of economics, and in particular, the drivers of the economics of technological innovation in a way in which our physical collections are not. Now, the economics of technological innovation, in some senses, don't much suit archival purposes or archival needs. And I wanted to give you an example. This is an LTO tape, and many archival collections are stored on tapes very similar. Digital archival collections are stored on tapes very similar to this. Whether the archive itself has a tape library and owns the tapes, or has bought storage in the cloud from someone like Amazon, and essentially is hiring someone else's tapes, a lot of our digital collections end up on media like this. An LTO tape has a potential lifespan of 20 to 25 years, which is short in archival terms, quite long in technology terms. But the archivist finds that the pace of innovation in terms of new versions of LTO tapes being released and old versions of LTO tapes being retired is much, much more rapid than the life of the physical media. So the infrastructure, the hardware and software infrastructure that you need to maintain your archival storage service is, even though the tapes might last 25 years, is churning at the space of every 4 or 5 years. So whether you like it or not, as an archive, you're having to continue to invest in renewing that infrastructure, not over a 25-year cycle, but over a 4 or 5 year cycle, simply because of the economics of technological innovation, in this case around storage. And that's essentially that the storage industry is driven by backup rather than by archival needs. And the growth in the production of data and the need to store data at scale for low cost means that it's going to be better to take the benefit of the increased storage capacity per pound or dollar. Is going to be better writ large to take advantage of that than to have long-term stability. And the archive just finds itself bound up in this fundamental working through of the economics of technological innovation in a way that isn't suiting us. Now, it's also instructive to think about the different types of capability and archive needs, and how economics is shifting or shaping, and what it makes sense for archives to do and what it makes sense for other people to do. And again, the transaction cost theory of economics, which helps explain why some things are done by big firms and some things are done by small firms, I think is quite instructive in terms of helping us think about what kinds of archival capability should archives seek to have for themselves, and what kinds of things should archives buy from other people and not seek to do for themselves. And underneath this is a shift that we see around something called commoditization. That's a shift for any kind of good or product that starts out as being an innovation and gradually over time becomes so commonplace that it becomes a commodity. The classic example would be something like electricity, where 100 years ago, if you wanted electricity, you would probably need to have your own mini power station. There were no standards. You would have to decide for yourself what level of voltage you want. Today, power has become commoditized. Electrical power has become commoditized, and we buy the power that we need. So this process of commoditization, particularly commoditization of technology, is also working its way through in terms of this question of what does the archive do for itself and what does the archive buy? Now, thinking about this in terms of digital preservation and this model that we have, this is the Open Archival Information System Reference Model, we can see, and I've used a technique here called Wardley mapping, we can see how commoditization is impacting on different parts of archival capability. So in particular, archival storage, which has been very much in the kind of realms of the product for quite a long time, is moving or has moved to being a commodity. If you want to have massive storage, you can buy it in the cloud. Whereas access, and in particular having facilities for providing access in the kinds of contexts that we need to manage in terms of digital archives, is still much more bespoke. Similarly, work around preservation planning. So it's certainly instructive for archives to reflect on what is becoming commoditized and to be making decisions about where best to put their effort and energy in terms of keeping records and in terms of how to spend their money. Now, to make the point about the commoditization of storage, Amazon Web Services, for example, provide something they call deep archive storage in all of their regions. Now, the fact they use the word archive is somewhat maddening because it is just storage, it's not an archive. But no matter, it makes the point about the commoditization of storage that we're seeing. And it makes the point about the question that the archive confronts about how to spend its money to best effect in terms of archival value. If the archive is spending its money on storage infrastructure of its own, it means it's not spending its money on improving intellectual control. And maybe an archive would do better relying on someone else's storage and spending its money on intellectual control. Really interesting questions that the archive confronts here. And this dilemma about what does the archive do and how vertically integrated does the archive seek to remain is posed by not least the ever-increasing layering that we see of technology as our technology systems become more sophisticated and more complex. And there's an argument that sees the digital archive very much as working in and around a complex system. Now, what to do? So there are several interventions, and we think that one way forward is through refining our approach to measurement and feedback. And we're particularly interested in understanding what's posing risks to our digital records and how we might measure risk in order to decide what kinds of intervention we need to make as a digital archive. And we've constructed a model for understanding digital preservation risk in a particular context. This is called DIAGRAM, the Digital Archiving Graphical Risk Assessment Model, which you can find on the UK National Archives website and try for yourself. And what this model allows us to do is quantify the risks that we have to our digital records and to scenario plan different kinds of interventions in order to be able to see what interventions are likely to make most impact in terms of lowering long-term digital preservation risk. And it's underpinned by a probabilistic model that centers on two key factors for the digital archive: renderability and intellectual control. And because it's a tool that's designed for archivists to use, then users can engage with the tool by essentially working through a number of questions. Now, we think this kind of practice of building models and using measurement and scenario planning is part of the practice that a digital archive needs to know and to be confident in how it's turning its effort, its energy, its money into maximum benefit in terms of preservation, risk management. It's not the only area that is challenged by digital disruption. Intellectual control in particular, and the archivist's hankering to bring order on chaotically organized digital collections is another area for careful reflection too. Bringing order is quite expensive. And again, there's some lessons we can perhaps look to from the past. As someone with a computing background, I've long been inspired by Ted Nelson's publication way back in the middle 1970s, Computer Lib. And he talks about how information is intertwingled, the hierarchical and sequential structures are usually forced and artificial. Intertwingularity is not generally acknowledged. People keep pretending they can make things hierarchical, categorizable, and sequential when they can't. Well, we've been able to make things somewhat hierarchical, categorizable and sequential with our physical collections, but we can't with our digital collections. We are going to have to embrace intertwingularity in our catalogues as digital archives and as digital archivists. And we're also going to have to embrace a level of uncertainty in the information that we have about our collections, particularly if we're using artificial intelligence for guiding us through appraisal and selection decisions, or for helping us gain intellectual control. A machine learning system is only going to say, well, there's an 80% probability that this record was created within this date and that date, and there's maybe a 70% possibility that it is a record worthy of long-term preservation for the archive. And learning to live with probabilities is a challenge for archivists with our liking for certainty. Not only is machine learning challenging us in the sense of forcing us to contemplate probability, it's allowing the creation of new types of content, synthetic content, content that has been confected from previous information rather than created. And this is an example from BuzzFeed News of a confected, synthesized, you might say fake, video of Barack Obama saying words that he never said. Now, again, archives are going to need to develop practice for dealing with synthetic content as well as content created for and by people. And in doing that, we're going to have to be mindful of our wider context, including the impact that archival practices have on the wider environment, the energy that we use and consume, and when we compute over collections, be that either compute for appraisal and selection, or compute for preservation, or compute for access. We need to weigh our environmental impact in the balance. And we need to manage access in a complex and sophisticated information rights landscape where we're dealing with the public interest in what should be known and individuals' own rights of privacy. it's very clear to us as a digital archive that we're not able to simply publish the entirety of our digital holdings on the web, nor is it sufficient for us to just lock everything up into a digital repository that no one can access or see, that we're going to need to find ways of enabling access, including publication, but not only publication, enabling a variety of forms of access so our collections have value, including forms of non-consumptive access, ways in which people can ask questions of a digital archival collection without taking the digital records away. So another area where the archive and the archives practice is being disrupted, and where we need to innovate in order to be able to deliver that traditional archival value of providing the answer to how do we know what we think we know. A lot for National Archives, indeed for all archives, to consider and think about. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully in there's been enough thoughts or observations for prompting some questions either to me or to Tom.
John, I hope you hear the clapping of the hands. And now I open the session for questions. I will take myself as the first questioner. First, we're very happy that you have a lovely spring in England. We are freezing too. We have a cold that is lasting for 10 days now here. So we're kind of a replacing of... Okay. Yeah. It's warming us up. If it's okay, we would be happy if you can send us a link to this diagram that you mentioned. It will be, we'll have a look at it.